All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with part two of the sort of post-age of quote-unquote age of exploration. We're going to be looking at what the Spanish Empire is doing with all of its newly discovered lands from the period 1450 to 1550. First, let's talk a little bit about some of the native peoples that they're encountering. Remember, Christopher Columbus, thinking that he was off the coast of India, referred to the native peoples as Indians. Well, they are not. They are Caribs and Arawak and so forth. The Arawak, for instance, populated the Greater and Lesser Antilles. These are the islands of the Caribbean Ocean, Caribbean Sea, beg your pardon. They cultivated various crops, maize and cassava, sweet potatoes, hot peppers. These were all relatively unknown in Europe, and in particular with maize, Indian corn, they will make a major impact on the diet of Europeans as they will be introduced. Okay. Cotton and tobacco, tobacco first, cotton later, will be incredibly important in sustaining the plantation life of the North American European settlements, as well as some of the plantations on the mainland of the Latin Empire. Although in many cases, sugar will be much more lucrative because sugar can't be grown in those northern climates, whereas cotton and tobacco can be. Um, uh, as in the case of some parts of West Africa, metals like copper, iron were not readily available. However, gold was. And so therefore Europeans will establish significant mining operations across the New World. At first, the Spanish tried to convert the Arawak, as under Columbus, but very quickly this conquest began into outright mistreatment of the natives. The natives suffered duly under the European hand because European diseases like smallpox were disastrous to to native populations. There was just virtually no resistance, and this lack of resistance came from the fact that there were very, very few large domesticated animals that natives came in regular contact with. That's how Europeans essentially build up immunities to certain diseases. It's because the most virulent diseases that Europeans encounter typically come from being in close quarters with cows and sheep and pigs and goats and so forth and horses. And so those immunities had built up through centuries, if not millennia, of domestication, which did not occur in North and South America. For greater detail on this, there's a seminal book that was written in the I would say the mid to late 90s by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel, really looking at those advantages that Europeans had when they entered into the new world, and that would be an interesting reference to look at. The book itself, there's documentaries on it, and there are also several shorter articles if you're interested in that. The Arawak did put up resistance, as in their rebellion of 1495. However, the Spanish responded by a slow enslavement of the native population and coercive means of controlling the native population, which which just declined so very rapidly that the natives of the Caribbean became very, very, very sparse uh, and opened the way to a more intense European settlement of the islands and the mainland. And here we see sort of a very famous image um, of starving dogs being let loose on the native peoples of the Caribbean in all of its grotesque horror as the sort of dandied conquerors stand watching as if watching some kind of blood sport. Now we turn our attention in the generation after explorers and the settlement of the islands the conquest of the mainland. And here we get into the idea of the conquistadors, right? These were Spanish military men of great prowess, and they had built up their reputation through the reconquest of Spain from the Muslim population, starting as early as the year 1000 and culminating in the 1492 expulsion of the Moors from the Kingdom of Granada in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. Um, the conquistadors will be used in the exploration, conquest, and settlement of the New World. Once the control of the major islands, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, are established by about 1511. So, we're talking with less than 20 years from the time that Columbus first set sail to the establishment of military control. That's a very rapid expansion and subjugation of that region. From that point forward, these fighters then will start looking at prizes on the mainland. Well, the first of these is Cortez, Hernan Cortez, who arrives on the mainland of what is today Mexico in 1519. He takes a very interesting approach. He looks at sort of playing the diplomatic game among the Aztec peoples, and that is plural for a reason. Uh, we have to remember that the Aztec Empire is just that, is an empire, so that there is a small ruling class of Aztecs who have subjugated other local um, tribes, and in the process of doing that, they made enemies of their subject peoples. Among them, the Tlaxcalans. These are the traditional enemies of the Aztecs. And so, as Cortez arrives, he starts courting these people who are on the outs with the governing authorities in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Um, the Aztec Emperor, Montezuma II, who reigned, as you see, those dates there, 1502 to 1520, first attempts to engage the Spanish using diplomacy, as he would with virtually any other population in central Mexico. Of course, for a while the Spanish play the game, but eventually the emperor becomes a prisoner of them. He is killed as the rebels as Aztec rebels revolt against the Spanish, actually driving the Spanish out of the city for a time until the Spanish are able to sort of return, gather up allies among the other central Mexican peoples. And after the 1521 outbreak of smallpox in the city, the Spaniards are able to return and very rapidly assert their domination of the imperial center and basically take over the Aztec Empire. And we can see the Aztec Empire here, right? Um, you see the areas in blue there are pockets of the Tlaxcalan populations. These are the folks that Cortez will use as allies in warring against the Aztecs. Of course, as soon as those conflicts are over and imperial rule is successfully overthrown, then Cortez turns on all of his former allies, and so that there is only one power in the land, and that is Spanish power. The situation in the Inca Empire is somewhat similar. Um, as opposed to what we saw with the Aztecs was the culmination, the Aztec culmination of imperial conquest. In the Inca, there was a unified empire already. However, there was a civil war within that empire. So that in 1531, Atahualpa emerged as a ruler against his own siblings and other allies. The war had raged for quite some time, and so therefore the Inca Empire was in a weakened state, as any empire or nation would be after a very significant civil war. And so Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro, is able to enter into this situation led by a very small force. We see there 180 men, 37 horses, and 2 cannon. Comes down out of the north from Panama, and they are able to create enough confusion among the natives that they can defeat a force of nearly 40,000, capture the emperor, and even though they attempt to, the emperor tries to bribe them with literally a room filled with gold and silver from floor to ceiling, which the Spaniards take. The Spaniards then decide to execute the emperor. There is a rebellion that ensues. The Spaniards are able to fight their way out of the city, but they capture the capital and of Cusco, and by 1572, they had essentially mopped up virtually all Inca resistance. So, two similar situations: unrest, distrust of imperial control, both in the Aztec and the Incas, allowed small contingents of these Spaniards to come in and wrestle control from these empires and assert Spanish dominion. In effect, the Spaniards, uh, the conquest did not rest entirely on the capabilities of the Spaniards, as much as they just happened to show up at the right place at the right time, or from the native perspective, the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay. And so we see here, just to give you a sense, how vast the Inca Empire was as it stretched down the Andes mountain regions. A very difficult terrain to control, and that is one of the reasons why it took the Spaniards so long to actually bring all of the Inca lands under control. As a fact, even after 1572, there were some regions that were still somewhat that were hostile and independent of Spanish control. So there's not a full conquest of the Inca as we see the very rapid conquest of Aztec territories in Mexico. Very well, and there's our consideration of the Spanish New World for now. We will start to look at, in the next series of lectures, we will look at how these territories are governed, what these New World societies look like as we bring together Europeans and natives, what the economies look like, and so on and so forth. But for now, thank you very much for listening.